Hi girls. Glasses, for me, are really important. They change the way I see the world. I really shouldn't be driving without glasses. Glasses, and their lenses in particular, help me to make sense of the world, help me to interpret the world. And the Anzac legend is a lens into the past. And we need to get our head around whether that lens is the right way to see the past. So, in this split video, we're going to look at the Anzac legend as a sense of a lens. As we go through it, I want you to think about, is history all in the way we see things? Where's evidence fit? Is history just about individual perspectives? Is history really about who tells the history and why they tell it? I'd like you to think about, do we only tell the history that we want to hear? Or do we tell our histories in a way that we want to remember it? So let's reflect on these questions as I throw a few little exercises at you. What do you see in this image? I'm sure you've seen it before, but take a moment and get your mind to play with this and think, perhaps history is a little bit like this image, where initially we see things from one perspective when perhaps another is equally true. A similar example is that image. When we look at this image here, we have to think, should I be seeing the old lady? Should I be seeing the young lady? When we're talking about the Anzac legend, we're looking at a particular version of history, a particular way of seeing history. And historians have to draw upon evidence. Rather than just what we want to see or what we see immediately, we need to look at the evidence. So perhaps historians are a little bit like the blindfolded scientist studying an elephant, where each historian picks up a different piece, a different part, and says what they think it is. They draw a conclusion based upon a little bit of the evidence. Maybe Charles Bean, maybe Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, when they created the Anzac legend, were looking at a particular piece. Maybe it was just what they wanted to see. Maybe it was only a part of the picture. And we've got to think about how much does that matter when we're studying history. So let's explore this a little bit. I'd like to put to you that the Anzac legend gave and gives people a really important lens, like my glasses, through which we look at the world and make sense, make meaning of this Australian experience in World War I that was so traumatic to so many people. The Anzac legend threw a spotlight on. Think of that pool of light on one part of the stage. Threw a spotlight on, or highlighted, focused on, emphasised or privileged just some parts of the Australian war experience, and even largely left out some of the reality. And that happened until quite recently. The Anzac legend highlighted positive characteristics of the Anzacs, especially the Anzacs who were at Gallipoli in 1915. It highlighted, put a spotlight on, their achievements, their successes. In a campaign at Gallipoli, there was ultimately a massive military defeat and failure. Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, Charles Bean, picking up on characteristics, achievements, successes, the positives of what was in many respects a military mess. Perhaps as we look at the Anzac legend, it has an important place in our national memory, the way we look at ourselves as a nation of Australia and think back. Perhaps it's got an important place in our culture. Perhaps Anzac Day is one of our most solemn and sacred days as a nation. Perhaps it's a really important role in shaping the way in which Australians see themselves. Perhaps it's being used to create a sense of Australian identity, a way of identifying some quintessential Australian values. But we need to remember as historians and people in a history class that those issues, while they're important, may not be our main focus. We need to remember that it doesn't necessarily provide a full picture of the Australian experience of the Great War of 1914-18. So it might do a whole range of important things, but is it good history is a different question. And when we look at it a little bit further, we'll go that the Anzac legend tended to emphasise the actions of the men of the ANZAC who served particularly at Gallipoli. It especially reveres, even among those Anzacs at the first landing on the 25th of April in 1915. And it traditionally emphasises those Australian Anzac soldiers who took part in the dawn landing of April 25th, 1915. It doesn't even talk about the reinforcements who came later and so on. So I guess by definition, the people who landed at Gallipoli at that time were largely fit, young and white men, because Australia had rules about who could enlist. But this isn't our entire historical reality. It's not the entire Australian experience of the First World War. So when we're studying the Anzac legend, we can look at it as an important part of our culture. But in terms of history, does it capture everything we need to know? It leaves people out, and we need to look at those. So firstly, the Anzac legend tells a selective version of the experiences of the Anzacs who were at Gallipoli. It includes some of their experiences. And those experiences are told largely through the eyes of a few, 2, maybe 3 journalists who had a particular agenda to promote a narrow view of what they believed it meant to be an Australian at the start of the 20th century. So it's very selective, even in the experiences it talks about at Gallipoli. Now, the traditional version of the Anzac legend actually tends to overlook the sacrifices and experiences of the AIF who served in large numbers on the Western Front and in Palestine. It also leaves out those members of the armed forces who served in the Navy, who were in other locations again. It's largely an army story of Gallipoli in its narrowest version. So this is very much not the entire history of the experiences of World War I. The Anzac legend, in its most traditional way, also overlooks the sacrifices and experiences of women. And we know that there were many, many women who served in the war. They are often as nurses and carers involved in aid stations, who are involved in providing canteens and so on for the troops, often in very dangerous locations. In fact, there were many women who died during the warfare of the First World War near the battlefronts. The traditional version has a narrow focus of the men who served at Gallipoli through the eyes of other men. And that's okay, but it's not the full experience of Australians. And if we're looking at the full experience of Australians, we need to be aware that the Anzac legend doesn't capture all of those. In recent years, the Australian War Memorial and other groups have been very, very active including women into the way we remember the war. But in the traditional versions of the Anzac legend, there's a silence around so many people. This silence also encompasses people who are not of European background. Most notably are the large number of Indigenous Australians who made their way, often against the odds, into the Australian AIF and Anzac. They actually had to try extremely hard to get into the army. They had to deceive their way into the AIF because of some of the laws that were in place. But the imagery around the Anzac legend tends to be very European, very white. We see things through a very narrow lens. And it doesn't take long for historians to expose that while they might not have been the majority, there certainly were a significant number of Indigenous Australians who took part in the First World War. Now, while we're talking about that, it's worth me also mentioning that there were even Asian Australians who took part in the First World War, who made their way into the armed forces. Australia had a significant number, for example, of Chinese Australian citizens who wanted to serve in the First World War. Finally, the traditional version of the Anzac legend tends not to talk about the home front. It tends not to talk about the experiences of those in Australia who contributed to the war effort. That included children. Children did things like raise money, they sewed socks, they recycled goods to be sent overseas. Children, the aged, the elderly, all of these people were doing various activities to try and support the troops in the front line. The home front is not part of this Anzac legend. It doesn't capture the entire Australian experience. Perhaps it doesn't. We shouldn't have that expectation it does. But as historians, if we're exploring the experiences of Australia in the First World War, we need to move beyond the Anzac legend. So when we think about this, the question is, why do we have an Anzac legend that leaves things out? Well, I tend to wonder whether the Anzac legend is really a way of making sense of this great war without a focus being on the losses of troops, the many, many dead, the suffering, the shell shock, the PTSD that the soldiers who returned must have felt, the pain of loss, the wounded, the amputees. Perhaps the Anzac legend told a story that was very important after 1918, when Australians struggled to make sense of the pain they were feeling. Perhaps it gave meaning to a war that most Australians didn't understand why it existed. Most Australians, like you, picked up the story at the invasion of Belgium by Germany in the Schlieffen Plan. But the war's origins were more complex and obscure than that, around an assassination of an Austrian archduke by a Serbian. A confusion at the heart of what the war was for added to the pain, and so perhaps the Anzac legend gave a meaning of what this war meant to Australia and Australians. Perhaps the Anzac legend gives Australians a set of values, something that the community can unify around. Perhaps it provides a shared set of role models in Australian history that Australians can point to when we don't have our heroes of our revolutions like the Americans might. We don't have a George Washington figure or a Ben Franklin. We don't have a Napoleon such as the French. We don't have the Garibaldi of Italy. But we do have the founders of modern Australia that we have framed as being the Anzacs. And we can share those role models as a way of inspiring young people, particularly in their values when times are tough. Perhaps we needed these senses of meaning being made after 1918. But that was a long time ago. It's 100 years ago at the time I'm making this video. Does the Anzac legend have a place in modern Australia? Well, I think yes. But ultimately that's something you need to make your mind up about. There are those who say no. And some of their criticisms include these kind of ideas, which at times are quite valid. They would argue that perhaps there's many people who confuse the Anzac legend with the entire historical reality, and perhaps have a smattering of understanding of Anzac itself, and that's their full and total sum experience of a real and traumatic 4 years of Australian history during the Great War. And maybe that does a disservice to the entire experience. Perhaps the traditional version of the Anzac legend just leaves out too much. And maybe the consequences of that is that as a community we don't honour, we don't remember the sacrifices of Australians of all backgrounds, genders, ethnicities, who contributed to the war effort between 1914 and 1918. There are some who would argue that the Anzac legend has been used as a way of defining the very concept of being Australian. And that this concept, because it is associated with a group of essentially white European men at Gallipoli at a certain time and place through the eyes of particularly two journalists, perhaps that's too narrow a way of understanding what it means to be Australian, and that we as Australians need to embrace everyone, to call upon everyone into our understanding of what it means to be community. There are these conflicting debates around the Anzac legend in Australian society that we're not going to resolve in a unit like this. But it's something you need to reflect on. I'd put to you, therefore, that maybe one of the best ways to start considering finishing this unit is to reflect on these very famous words associated with Anzac Day. The words of the Ode. When we think about everyone who contributed to the Australian war effort in the First World War, we need to remember that those who fell, those who died in war, shall not grow old as everyone who survived the war grew old. That age won't weary them nor the years condemn, and that at the going down of the sun and in the morning, we should remember them.